Welcome everybody to another Motec webinar. My name's Pete Swinney and today's topic is tuning based on log data. Thanks for tuning in. So today's topics are how to set up the ECU to record the data that we're going to do our tuning from, how to conduct the testing to make it easy to read that data and to therefore make the accurate changes back in the ECU, how to download the data from the ECU so that we can get it into the laptop and then analyze the data, and some real crude basics on I2 and just how to use it enough to find out how the engine is running as far as fuel tuning goes. This webinar is based on just doing the tuning of the fuel map based on the log data. To tune an engine overall, fuel injection timing, ignition, cam control, drive-by-wire, butterfly control is a very large subject. So today we're just going to talk about how to do the fuel tuning, which is probably the thing that most people do the most often. Okay, so we are going to learn how to look at that data and make changes in the ECU so that you can develop and improve on your fuel map. Alright, starting off with ECU Manager, we want to connect to the ECU. Obviously first open the ECU Manager itself, and before we get started, once we're online, if we can see, just get the arrow going here, we want to make sure we are online and that the green icon down the bottom here is green. That tells you are connected in the version of software you're using. I would like to encourage everybody to be using the latest software, and this screenshot's a little bit old. It says down there, if you can see it, version 3.30K. So current version 3.52 something, I think. So either way, we want you to have the latest software from the website. Make sure that's installed and updated in the ECU. Side note, while you're doing that, always make sure to disconnect the coils and ignition modules or igniters when you are upgrading your software. Alright, so before we start checking that the fuel map's correct on this engine that you've got, we need to make sure that the ECU has the Lambda and logging upgrades. If it doesn't, we're not going to have much luck today. So if we look up the top when we're online on that first screen that opens with ECU Manager, you'll see a list of the upgrades that this particular ECU has got. We can see the serial number here, and we can see that it's got dual Lambda and 1 meg of logging. That tells me it's an M800. Alright, so once we've got that sorted, we can move on to opening up the software itself. So normally when you open up the software, you'll see a standard page like that, unless you've already modified it. And some key things on here in the standard setup are the Lambda histogram or chart recorder. And on this chart recorder, we see by standard setup the Lambda 1, which is the red trace, and the green trace is the Lambda aim value. Now we'll talk about that more shortly. But really what we're interested in doing at this point is setting up the data logging so that when we go and test this engine, whether it be in a jet ski, a boat, a circuit car or a buggy or whatever, we want to make sure we're recording the right information. There's no use going out and doing a half-hour test session to find out that you haven't bothered to log the Lambda channel or the RPM channel. That would be somewhat of a waste of time and fuel. So we'll start off with making sure everything is logged correctly. So the ECU itself will record any different channel values that we tell it to do. You can individually choose any channel within the ECU, and we can tell it how fast to log it, and we can define which channels we log. Alright, so after a logging session has completed, or a test session, we download that data and then we look at it on our I2 analysis software. It's a separate piece of software that we'll need to open up and have a look at the data using that software. So the nice part about this is that the engine can be monitored in its real world conditions. So if you give me the ultimate budget to tune an engine, I'm going to put it on an engine dyno, and I'm going to find out all about my ignition and my fueling and cam control and things like that. But I'm always going to do fine tuning of that engine in the vehicle itself. There will always be differences, as much as we may try to make them all the same on the engine dyno. There will always be a minor difference in the car, even if it's airflow into the air box. So we're always interested in seeing what's happening at the racetrack on the day that you want to win. So this is what we keep an eye on, and today it is all about tuning the fuel. Alright, so the idea is that we will conduct the test and we'll make accurate offline tuning changes. If you test properly and take your time and make a change, you should be able to get it perfect, the exact correct lambda or the correct air-fuel ratio the next time you run the engine. It's not always as straightforward as that, but you should be able to aim to do it in just one test to get the parts that you've changed dead accurate. Alright, so if we go into the data logging setup part of ECU Manager, which is adjust, data logging setup, and we'll start at engine sensors. So there are a whole lot of pages here, I don't know, 20 or 30 pages of different channels that we can select to log, and we can select the logging rate. So the one highlighted here is RPM, and we simply type in the number of times per second, which is the frequency that we want the ECU to log that channel at. So it starts, the options are 1, 2, 5, 10, 20, 50, 100 and 200. If we put in too high a number here, that simply wastes the logging time. The ECU is using up a lot of logged data or a lot of memory space to log a channel faster than it needs to be logged. So some suggested numbers are here to start with. So we want RPM, throttle position, manifold pressure, and lambda around these values. If our main fuel table axis is manifold pressure, we want to bump that to 20 Hertz. Alright, so 20 times a second. So whatever is on the main vertical axis of your fuel map, if it's throttle position, we need to be logging throttle position at least 20 times per second. RPM always at least 20, and manifold pressure actually normally 20, but if it's on a, say, a V8 supercar, a naturally aspirated multi-throttle body engine where manifold pressure is just simply picking up barometric pressure, we don't need to log it that fast. We certainly want to log our lambda channel at 20 Hertz, and the simple fact is, as we add the number of channels up, or we increase the number of channels that we're logging and increase the speed at which we log them, we lose the amount of logging time, and that's shown down the bottom here. Now if you're online to the ECU, you will see live the logging time disappearing as you add more channels and increase the frequency. And on the left hand side down here, the logged items or the number of channels increments up and down as you add and subtract the numbers beside each channel. So in this current config we have 48 channels logged, and we have a total logging time of 1,193 seconds. Now that is a little inconvenient, I have to say, so I'm actually going to grab my calculator now and go 1193 divided by 60. We have 19.8 minutes of logging. Now it really depends on how long you want to do your testing for as to how you configure all these channels up. The shorter the test time, that means the faster and the more channels you can log. It's going to be up to you to log things at the rate at which you can get that information and the amount of time you've got available to test. Now sometimes you may have to do a long period of time to come back in from a test. Now a good example for this is with a boat, often there is a 5-knot area that you've got to come through at idle. Now if you go out and idle out for a quarter of an hour to get out to the middle of the sea to where you want to do your testing, you do your testing and then you spend another quarter of an hour coming back through the 5-knot zone, then when you download the data, if you have only 15 minutes of data memory available, you'll get 15 minutes of idle and the end of your testing. There are two ways around that. well, there's actually 3 ways around it. I haven't got screens to show you because it's not the seminar is not really dedicated to this, but the 3 options are, 1, you can configure the start and stop log RPM level in the data logging setup to be higher than what your idle is. So for instance, if you are idling in at 2000 revs, you program your logging to start at 2500 and stop, say, at 2200. You can even make it higher. You can also configure the logging to start and stop on a switch. There's a feature in the M800 under a digital input where you can configure a log start-stop switch. So you can simply turn on that switch for when you want to do your logging and turn it off when you're completed, and then you can come in. And I'm not really sure off the top of my head why I had 3 for 3 reasons. So anyway, be aware that when you download the logging, in this case, we have whatever you pull out will be the last 20 minutes of logged data time, and that's what you get. The logging cycles around, it keeps overriding, so if you go out for a 1-hour test, you'll always get the last 20 minutes of that 1-hour test. Okay, moving on. So we are seeing what to record, how fast to record it, and our maximum number, that's a good point, is 64. You can keep adding channels and this number will keep going up, but you'll only get the first 64 channels recorded. So, testing. Now, if you're running a map that maybe someone has already given to you, or you've bought the car out, it's been raced by someone else, or there's an existing map in there that's not bad, and you're a little bit nervous about tuning for the first time, what I advise most people to do is just add 10% overall fuel trim to the whole map. That keeps it safe and makes it so that we can just do a little bit of testing and see where the tune is. If we're running with a fresh tune or an absolute guess to start with, well, there's no use putting 10% on top of a guess. You might as well just stick with your best guess. The other thing to do, if we've got an ignition map that we have got from someone or you've predicted or whatever, maybe it's come back from a car that's been running, I'll always pull some timing out of it while we get the fueling close. So the number you pull out will depend on the engine itself. As a guide, I'm pulling 4 degrees out of what would normally have been a race ignition tune. I want to pull the 4 degrees out. Now, maybe this is an instance where you've changed injectors or you've fitted some sort of new fuel system, new fuel pressure regulator. While you get on top of the fuel tuning, let's just pull the timing out. 4 degrees won't affect the tuning that much, and it will hopefully keep the engine safe if you end up running it particularly lean while you're out testing those first few times. So the first thing, if I'm starting with a new tune, the first thing I'm going to do, and what I call it is I go and have a bit of a look up in the guts of the map. I want to get out there and get right up into somewhere where there's a good medium amount of load to high load, depends on the type of engine, and have a look and see what the mixture is like, the air-fuel ratio or the lambda readings are like at that point. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time getting the idle perfect on a fuel map that I don't know is right. There's no point in retuning the whole fuel map by 20 numbers when at the beginning you could have overall trimmed the whole map by 20 numbers and it would have been so much closer to start with. Alright, so what we want to do is up the top, somewhere in the middle of the map where you've got a decent injector pulse width, if it's a boosted engine and a little bit of boost, do a quick test and have a look up there and just see if it's terribly lean or terribly rich. And what we'll do on that very first test is have a quick look and use the overall fuel trim to get it close. As I say, if you've got a fuel map with numbers ranging from, let's say, 45 to 65, and that very first outing you go out and you see that you're going to need a 40% bigger number, well, there's no use in tuning every side on the map to be 40% bigger, one side at a time. You're better to add 40% to the overall trim of the fueling, and then that will probably, if the map is approximately the right shape, that will get a good hunk of the work out of the way on just one adjustment. Alright, so here's an example of what I've seen happen. We've got a reasonable map presented, and maybe this is a map that is off an engine of a similar type to what you've got. You might end up with a map, you might have an Evo 9 or a Subaru or a jet ski or something like that, and the general map shape for a standard style engine, even sort of medium to high boost, will always kind of be roughly the same. Now in this case we can see the customer has started with a map, and they've started it up and they've done some tuning around that idle and sort of lower RPM, and we can see that they have pulled a whole lot of fuel numbers out, and I can see that they have been tuning on site, and there's little asterisks or a mark at each point where they've been tuning. So if we were to carry on like this, we would have to pull all these numbers out everywhere as we tuned, and that's an awful lot of work and makes it difficult to get the Lambda correct on that first time, because as you are pulling the numbers out at sites where there is a large number change like here, the Lambda reading will be picking up a reading from this number and picking up a reading from this number, and you'll be getting an average, and it won't be what you really need. So it's very difficult to hold the engine exactly on site when you are doing testing like in the vehicle or on the water, that type of thing. So on an engine dyno you can hold on site and it's much easier, but we're talking about tuning here in situ, like in the vehicle, in the buggy, in the boat. So what I would have recommended to this person was put all these numbers back up kind of where they were at a higher space, run the engine up here and see how bad the fueling is. Use the overall fuel trim to get the fueling right up in this mid-range area, and in this case you could have overall fuel trimmed the whole map down, and then when we actually go to individually tune these sites you wouldn't need to make the number changes as much. Alright, so again, how to test. We want to warm it up first. There is no point in trying to tune an engine that's got some cold start enrichment on that. I think everyone understands that. So if most cold start enrichment comes out between 40 and 50 degrees, maybe 60 degrees Celsius, and that extra enrichment will show the engine running rich. The last thing we want you to do is go, oh, it's too rich, and then make the fuel tune leaner, which will then, when it warms up, run too lean. So need to have that engine hot before we do any tuning. We need to drive the vehicle smoothly and with a steady throttle. If you're moving up and down on the throttle all the time, two things happen. One, you don't get a chance in the log data to see a consistent RPM and throttle position, or RPM and manifold pressure, where we've got a steady Lambda reading. As you move the throttle up and down erratically, you are jumping from one site to the other on the fuel map, and you never get time to see what the Lambda reading is. And just a side note at this point, we'll talk about it again later, is that the Lambda reading is always delayed slightly. It's taking a reading from exhaust gas that's traveled down the exhaust pipe. So I always allow between 0.2 and 0.4 of a second in the data to measure the Lambda for the RPM and throttle that you recorded at that time. So this Lambda is always delayed. So we want to try and get pieces of data to analyze where we've got steady throttle and steady RPM for more than at least half a second. I really want to see 1 second of RPM at one point and throttle position at one point. So in order to do that, drive the vehicle. And out in, for instance, a car, out when you're tuning, the hardest part is driving the car and not tuning the engine. And for those of you who have done some live tuning, the quick Lambda feature is very simple. So I've often taken my son with me, and he sits there and I just yell Q and he pushes the button when I'm holding it on site. Getting the car to hold the right RPM and throttle position to where you want is by far the hardest job. So concentrate on getting that right, and your analysis will be so much easier and your fuel tuning will be so much easier later on. So I keep saying try to get the engine on site. So what that means is inside the ECU is a fuel map, and it's just a whole lot of pigeonholes where information gets stored. So each of those pigeonholes ends up at a particular crossing point of RPM and, if we talk naturally aspirated, throttle position. Whatever's on the vertical axis of your fuel map is the point at which intersects with RPMs. So, for instance, if we are to hold at 4,000 RPM and exactly 50% throttle, that's what I call being on site in the fuel map. So that means if I'm holding at that exact RPM and that exact throttle position, I end up with a lambda reading that is the result of the number that's on that site. So that means I don't have to guess if the thing is rich or lean because I'm halfway between two of these sites, and I'll talk about this more later. So we really need, and in most cases, fuel maps are started with 500 increment sites. So it'll be 3,000, 3,500, 4,000, 4,500. So normally what you would be doing is aiming to get your RPM at each of those increments, so 3,000, 3.5, 4,000, 4.5, and holding it for 1 second at each of those points. And then also, while you're at those incremental RPM levels, trying to get the throttle position at different points. So that way you're getting onto each of the sites in the fuel map, so we can look at that. So we're really trying to hold that throttle position, and as I say, there's two ways you can do it. You can hold one throttle position and let the RPM increase, and in a car that's not too hard to do. You'll sit there and physically hold the throttle position. If someone is with you and has a laptop, they might be able to tell you you're exactly at 40%, and you might just start at very low RPM by holding your foot on the brake, putting the throttle at 40%, then letting the brake go, and you let the car slowly accelerate through the RPM, trying to keep your foot very steady. The other way you can do it is to try to hold a constant RPM and increase the throttle position slowly. So by riding the brake, which is not probably the best idea for the brakes, you can hold it at, say, 3,500 RPM and then slowly put your foot down. Now again, none of that's easy, but we're really trying to maintain that steady RPM and throttle position for half to 1 second. And there is no doubt in this world that the best tool for that job is a dyno. So on a dyno, we can sit there, whether it be a chassis dyno or an engine dyno, and physically go to each RPM and throttle position intersection or site and wait for the lambda to steady and get that recording. So we might be doing live tuning on dynos, but the reality is out at the racetrack, we don't have that luxury. We want to fine tune, and so this is the way to do it. Now, if it is at a practice session at a racetrack, the driver's not going to do what you ask him. He's not going to go out there and ride the brake and do things like that. We've got to work with whatever the driver runs at. The reality of that is wherever the driver is running at the racetrack, that's where the engine's being used, and that's certainly the areas we want to concentrate on. Alright, so once we've done our test, we want to download the data. So we need to power up the ECU. The cars come in, we connect to it with the cable, and we go into our ECU Manager. We want to unload the data, and to do that we go to Utilities, Get Log Data, and the shortcut for that, which seeing as you're doing usually a lot of downloading, I'd encourage you all to learn that, and that is Control and F8. So car comes in, slam the cable in, have ECU Manager already open, Control F8, and out comes the data. At the end of the data stream, you'll see it chonk out with little blue squares going across the screen. It will ask you if you want to clear it. In most cases, if it's a first time, you might want to leave it in there if you're nervous about the whole process, but normally I will clear it. So you clear that data. It means next time you go out, it's going to be with a fresh tune, and we want a fresh lot of data. We don't want to mix them up. So at the completion of the data, it'll ask you to fill in some details. Now this is actually, if you've got time, really important to do, because this data you will look at in 5 minutes time, but you'll also look at it in 6 months time, 1 year's time, and 2 years time. So we really want to put in the comments section here what the test's been about. Has it been a practice session where the engine had a big hiccup at 4,000 revs? Well, write it down here. Talk to the driver, if possible, about how the test went. Slower than normal, raining, whatever you want to put in here to tell us about what created that data. The other thing we want to do is check and see where the data is going. So in this details editor, we can enter the information about the car itself and where the data is going. And you'll see the logging directory here. And the logging directory, in this case, is C, Motec, log data. And in the case here, I've got a Yamaha subfolder. But by default, if this is your first time at a tuning, and it's a new ECU, the default will be C, Motec, log data. Alright, so also at this time, if this is the first time you've connected, it's a little bit annoying, I have to say, it will keep prompting you for all the information to be filled in the event in the vehicle. So take the time and do it the first time. Enter the information. You can put in the weight, the size of the vehicle, the length, give the vehicle a name, identify it, whether it's its race number, where you are, is it call to park, is it the first test, qualifying, all that information. The first time you do that, gets it out of the way, and from then on all you'll need to do is enter the comment. Okay. Alright, so once that data is there, it's sitting in that directory in your laptop, you then need to open up i2. i2 is our analysis program. If you don't have the Pro Analysis upgrade in your hardware, in your dash or ECU, you will need to use i2 Standard. i2 Standard is still a very, very powerful program and certainly more than good enough to do engine tuning. This webinar is not about how to configure or use i2, but there are definitely other webinars that you can view that will tell you how to configure i2. So we'll just skim over the basics of that. Alright, so we just want to get started and we want to use a circuit project, and we want to open a log file. So you can see by clicking on the folder, normal Windows folder, you can go and open a log file. And once that log file is open, if this is the first time that you've been in i2, a good idea is to unlock the layout. So this means you can manipulate the the layout of how the data looks, whether it's using time distance graphs or gauges and things like that you may want to change. Alright, and if you've got it laid out in a reasonable fashion, you'll end up with what we call the squiggly lines in a time distance graph. This is the graph the type of layout that I would encourage everyone to use while they're getting to learn data analysis. So we want to keep the number of channels on here low to keep it simple. In this case, I've got engine RPM, throttle position, and lambda. Alright, they're my three key tuning parameters. This is obviously a naturally aspirated engine, so they're the three parameters that I'm interested in. Also on here we happen to have GPS speed, so this is probably a marine-based piece of logging. So here is the channel name, so that appears on the right-hand side, and the number next to it is the channel value at the cursor. When you're in your version of i2, wherever you click the cursor, the line will follow, and wherever that line intersects through the data, you get the exact data value at this point. There's also a nice little feature which we won't expand into too much today, but it's quite handy. If you press the M key, you get the min, max, and average numbers for all the data that appear on the page. So as you zoom in, these numbers will change. So that's the minimum number for the RPM that you see. The maximum number, when it comes to RPM, is quite useful. So I can see straight away the maximum number RPM that pulled on this little particular test here was 88.26. Alright, and the same for all the channels. Alright, so here's a capture of some logging from I think it's an open wheeler in this case, at a circuit. We can see the RPM, throttle position, and lambda are again our three key channels that we're looking at. I also like to have on the bottom, we don't have to see it proportionally very large, the engine temp and air temp. Both of these affect the lambda to a great degree, and I want to know when I'm going to do my tuning that my air temperature and engine temperature are in the normal window and their compensation tables are not affecting what the lambda reads. So these need to be in the part of the ECU where you would consider them to be normal. If the engine temperature was 20 degrees, then I expect the lambda would be rich, and I'm not going to try fixing that in the fuel table because it's got cold start enrichment. If the air temperature was 120 degrees, I'd expect there would be a rich compensation on that, trying to cool the air temp and cool the engine. So I'm not going to try and fix the fuel map for a rich mixture because I've got a compensation coming from the air temperature. So this view here, just as a note, we can see this is it's a car. It's got gear changes. We can see as it goes up in the gears, the RPM rate of change gets slower. Okay, so this in this case was a 6-speed, so this would be 6th gear, 5th gear, 4th gear, and 3rd gear. We can tell by looking at it. Drops down, RPM drops, next gear accelerates to the top of the gear range, down it comes, and then so on. So this is a real piece of data from a track car. We can see the driver lifting the throttle at the top of each gear change so he can change into the next gear. And here we can see the lambda trace. Alright, so what I want to do though is I want to zoom in on a particular point. We actually want to go through the data piece by piece and look at how the engine is running. We want to look at how rich or lean the lambda is at given RPM and throttle positions. So to do that, we need to zoom in on a specific piece of data so we can look at it more closely. So by doing that, we double click at this point, and then by dragging and holding the mouse button down, I want to drag across sort of 5 or 10 seconds worth of data, and then when you click at the end, you'll have now zoomed into that piece of data. So here we can see basically one straight, it may be, of 6th, 5th, 4th and 3rd at pretty much full throttle. And if I'm to choose that I want to look at 8,000 RPM and I want to look at full throttle, that intersection, I'm best doing that at a point where the RPM's consistent, or trying to the RPM's not moving a lot. So obviously in the highest gear possible, we have the RPM, see it's not increasing at a great rate of change. So right in the middle of this, I can pick a point, and in this actual example here, I have converted the lambda reading, which is what we would normally read, into air-fuel ratio. The reality is I've put the screen in the wrong order, but you'll have to forgive me for that. So you'll see why in a minute. We've got an air-fuel ratio of 12.8 for all the guys that use air-fuel ratio. And at 100% throttle, or 99.8, it's near enough to 100, and at 8,000 RPM. Okay, now you can see here I've got this same screen, but I've got it back on lambda, which is what I should have shown you. So the reality for tuning Motex is that we only really recognize lambda inside the ECU Manager as being the way to tune. The reason for that, and again you'll see shortly, is that lambda is always the same for all fuels. Lambda 1 is lambda 1 on all fuels, whether it be diesel, petrol, E85, nitro, methanol, LPG. Lambda 1 is lambda 1, and it represents the same mixture, if you like. So some people I know still tune on air-fuel ratio, so I thought I'd show you how to convert from lambda into air-fuel ratio. So by right-clicking on the channel itself, the lambda channel, you can go to the channel properties, and that brings open this text box here, or this screen, and in here you can change from lambda to air-fuel ratio. When you do that, you end up with a screen that is out of range on the scaling. See, the scaling from here is 1.2 to 0.65, and when you go to air-fuel ratio, as you'll see back here, we need a scaling from 15 to 10. So you'll need to change the scaling to deal with that. Okay, I actually have a page for you on that today. So you can move backwards and forwards between air fuel ratio and lambda, but one thing I can tell you though is that when you go to enter the correction numbers into the ECU, we have a feature that will only work on lambda. So really you need to be working in lambda. Now here is a table that tells you the difference between all the different fuels. This is taken from our PLM manual if you want to look at it in hard copy. And basically it says if you have a reading of, let's go to 0.90 on lambda, that is 13.2 if your air fuel ratio if you're using petrol, 5.8 if you're using methanol or alcohol, 14.0 for LPG and 13.1 for diesel. So you can see if you're moving around with fuels or mixing fuels, the ball keeps, or the goalposts keep moving as far as which air fuel ratio to aim for. Whereas if you learn lambda, it's always the same number no matter what the fuel. Alright, so here's another example of some logging that I've had someone go out and collect. This is based on a jet ski log file, and I've asked them to go out and do as we did, as we suggested at the beginning of the test procedure. Go out and at each RPM level try and hold it for 1 second. So you'll see through the data here we have nice steps of data where the RPM is being held, and we're going to be able to go through this data and go to each step and record. So in the exact example we have here, we have RPM at 5.5, we have manifold pressure, in this case all but 90 kPa, and a lambda reading of 0.91. The idea is to go through the data and record all the different lambda readings for all the different RPM and manifold pressure points or throttle position points that you have at your disposal. You only have to work from whatever the test pilot has given you. The smoother and the more the smoother the data and the longer he spends at each incremental point, the easier this job is. I'll just go back to it and show you why the throttle transitioning is no good for reading lambda. So if we have a look at this data here where we see the driver coming on and off the throttle at the gear change or when he's accelerating, at this point here we really have no idea what the lambda is running. And each time the throttle is lifted and pressed again, you get a small blip in the lambda. And that blip comes from some acceleration enrichment, and there's a big puff of air going in when the driver puts his foot flat again. And often it's very, very difficult to get an absolutely perfect lambda line all the way through. Now, it's not until the RPM has been steady for some time that the lambda is smoothed out. And you can see in between the gear changes here that the lambda line is a lot easier to read. And when we zoom in on it, we can see that. So we'll just go forward a page. Here's what I was talking about. See, at every time the throttle moves a lot, we get quite a change in lambda, and we can't use that. And that change is decaying out as the enrichment or enleanment is being affected, and it's not till this point here that we can kind of take an accurate reading. So that's probably 0.2 to 0.3 of a second. And so what I'm trying to do, see here, right in the middle, nice accurate logging change, or a nice accurate logging sample point. And that's what we're looking for. Okay. Alright, so in this case here, if we're following on, we would go from our 5,500 site on our previous slide. Alright, and then we would go to the 6,000 site. That's the next intersection on our fuel map that we can enter a number. And this point where we would be entering 6,000 RPM and 100 kPa. And the lambda reading at this point is 0.88. It's not too far away. So we want to do that every 500 RPM to match up with our sites in our fuel map. And that way we'll get as many changes for a given test as we can. We want to see as many different points on the fuel map as we can get logging for the, get the lambda readings for. Alright, here's a nice little bit of data I came across to show you the influence of cut. And it's good to know that a lambda sensor is simply an oxygen sensor. It measures oxygen. That's its primary function. And it produces a voltage or a current different for different types of sensors. but that's proportional to the amount of oxygen in a cylinder. As the engine runs richer, it consumes more of the oxygen in the cylinder, and therefore the oxygen left over at the sensor point in the exhaust is less, and the reading changes on the lambda sensor, and Motec gives you a lambda reading. As the oxygen, or as the engine goes leaner, there's more oxygen left over, the lambda reading changes, and we can see it as a change in lambda reading. But another way to introduce oxygen into an engine is via cutting the ignition. So every time we get an ignition cut, the fuel goes out unburned because we've cut the spark on the cylinder, and we get a spike in lambda. Now here's a good example of what happens when you have a race car with full throttle cut or gear change ignition cut. We can see that we've had a gear change here because the RPM has dropped suddenly from one point to the other, but the driver has kept the throttle flat. But we know definitely that that's happened because we see a big spike in the lambda. So if we were to try and measure this point here and try and do fuel tuning at this lambda value, that would be completely wrong because that lambda value is based on some ignition cut, and that's not where you would place the cursor and measure the reading. In this case, we wait for the oxygen to deplete out of the cylinder, and along this line here is the true mixture or air-fuel ratio or lambda for that particular throttle position and these particular RPM. Alright, so these things are sent to make life difficult for you. You need to know that they exist. Similarly, if we richen an engine to the point of rich misfire, it will show it as lean. So if the engine is looking like it's rich everywhere and it gets richer and richer and richer and then all of a sudden goes lean, it's possible that that lean spot that you see is not the fuel map wrong, rather it's the ignition cut. Sorry, it's a rich misfire from ridiculous amounts of fuel in the combustion chamber. The other problem too, and we see this a lot with jet skis, is if your jet ski is tuned and you've got you're running right on the edge of your RPM limit and you're just touching your RPM limit and no more, and sometimes just as you go across the waves, little ripples in the water can cause the jet unit to unload just a little bit for a very short period of time. It'll just clip the RPM limit. You don't even see it in the RPM increase, like it's just a very small RPM increase, and you'll find it clips the RPM limiter. The RPM limiter invokes some ignition cut, and you'll see it little lean spikes appearing in the lambda trace. Of course, don't go rushing to your fuel map and adding fuel. That may even fix it because it'll lose power and then drop down off the RPM limit, and then it'll be too rich. So you'll take fuel out, it'll add power, and then you'll clip the RPM limit again, and then you'll be up and down all day long trying to get this thing tuned right without really knowing why. Alright, so things to be wary of. Alright, so the idea is we go through all the data. The more time you can spend on this, the better. Get in a place where no one's going to annoy you, and you'll see that any serious professional racing team has an area set aside for the data guy. Everyone's jealous because it's normally air conditioned, it's a nice comfy couch, and he's got a door he can lock. Now the reason for that is you need to concentrate. This is a very important part of tuning the car. You want to go through that data with as much time as you've got available and look at all the different points. So we don't want to look at one piece of data for 8,000 RPM in full throttle. I want to look at that whole log file and make sure every time I look at 8,000 RPM and 100% throttle, my lambda reading is, the same. Maybe the piece I've chosen is at a corner or something, and there's a little bit of fuel surge there, and everywhere else in the data it's actually different. So if at all possible, try and go all through the data, check those same points, and just keep updating a small spreadsheet like this. So in our previous example, we were at 8,000 revs and 100% throttle, and we had a reading of 0.87. We go through all the rest of the data, and it pretty much nails it as being 0.87. So what we can say for sure is that's what that particular intersection in the fuel map is creating. 8,000 RPM, 100% throttle. This is what our lambda is. So you go through all the data and you update your spreadsheet with as much as you can. Only write numbers in here unless you're sure. So it would be really typical to see for a racing car on a racetrack, especially a car with a small engine where the driver's virtually flat out most of the time. Lots of data points, accurate data we've got at full and almost full throttle, and a few incremental points when he's accelerating up to those levels. Maybe maintaining 60% throttle at 5,000 as he goes around a corner. We get good information from that. So be very sure that the data you're getting is real, because we're about to change the fuel map based on that information. Alright, so we go back to ECU Manager now that we know how the engine is running. And in ECU Manager we need to have a Lambda table configured. So this is our perfect Lambda reading if in the ideal world. It's the lookup table that the ECU will use when it goes to utilize this feature we're going to come to shortly. So talk to your mates, talk to your engine builders, talk to everyone and work out what should this engine be running at all these different throttle positions and these different RPMs. So in this case here we've only got to 2,500, the rest's hidden behind the graph. So we can see at 2,500 revs at 100% throttle we want the engine to be running 0.90. As the throttle comes off we can get it a little bit leaner, and as you can see at 10 and 20% throttle here we're around 0.93, 0.95. Alright, so you must have this Lambda table preloaded with all the correct figures, otherwise there's no point in trying to use the feature I'm going to show you next. Alright, you can get on our webinars. There's some advice on the kind of mixtures you would run. A rough guide for a naturally aspirated normal compression engine. You want to be running around 0.89 to 0.90 at full throttle. That will be maximum power. So kind of the numbers you see here. As you go up in boost, if it's a turbo engine, you want to run richer mixtures, basically to keep the exhaust temperature under control. Maximum power will still be between 0.87 and 0.91, but if you try and run a boosted engine at 2 bar of boost at 0.91, I think you're probably going to exceed 1,000 degrees exhaust temp, depending on a lot of factors, and potentially have exhaust valve and turbo problems. So you need to run richer if it's turbo. Generally speaking, 0.85 for 1 bar of boost, 2 bar of boost, maybe 0.80. While you're learning to tune, richer than all of that. Everything 10% richer than that to start with until you get on top of it. These would be your final perfect tune aim values. Alright, so we need our aim values in our Lambda map before we carry on. So we come to our fuel table now and we've got our information. So we place the blue highlighted, or the cursor point, the point at which we're going to enter our number, at the point of our first tuning point, to use that word too many times. So we have 8,000 RPM and 100% throttle, and we have the data entry blue highlight level right there. We then look up, we're going to push a number for Lambda Was here, based on the number that's in our spreadsheet. If we go back to our spreadsheet, I'm trying to make this go back. Oops, our spreadsheet said that at 8,000 revs, 100% throttle, the engine was running at 0.87 lambda. So we'll go forward again. So when we get to our fuel map, sorry, bad example here, I'm entering a number of 0.91 as what my lambda was. And so we enter what the lambda was at that point. So lambda was 0.91 in this example. And while you've got that screen up, it tells you what the lambda table was. Sorry, I just need to reinforce. You begin to type the number with the letter L for lambda was. If you simply type a number of 0.91 in here, it will put a 1 at that point, thinking it can only go to one number. Actually, it would put 0.9 at that point. So you need to type the letter L first. So you type the letter for L for lambda was, and then that brings up the screen. And then we go 0.91 or 0.87 in the case that we had previously. It shows you what the lambda table, what you previously put in the lambda table, 0.88. And in this case, 0.91 is leaner than 0.88, so therefore the number here should go up. And what happens is the computer works out exactly how much fuel to add, and down below here is an example of what it would add. It would add about 2.8 numbers in this example. So 2.8 gets added in this example to the number, and next time you run the engine at that exact site, the lambda will be 0.88. It's tuned. Okay? So while you're at it, if you were live tuning this and you pressed enter and did a live tune, did quick lambda, the computer would automatically put an asterisk at this point so you knew it had been done. But you're offline now. You're sitting in your nice little environment, and you are entering these numbers. So you need to manually backspace it so that if you get sidetracked, you've got to tear out for some reason, you need to know that you've tuned this data point. So by pressing the backspace key, you mark it with an asterisk. So what that looks like, if we go through all our data points, you can see here we got an asterisk. And when we look on our fuel 3D graph, we can see that all the data points that we recorded have been changed. Now we can see some haven't been changed. We didn't get any data points down here. See, there's some troughs here where we have no data changes, and we can see wherever the asterisk is that we've added fuel in this case. Alright, but we can see some troughs where there's been no fuel changes. Now once you get experienced, you'll be able to interpolate or smooth between these sites and get an idea of what the fueling should be at those points if the car was to give us data from there. Now what I can tell you, because this was a car that did a lot of full throttle, we've managed to get a lot of full throttle points, and this curve that we see here, the full throttle, so this is 100% throttle line here, this curve here will be repeated. That's the efficiency of the engine, how much air it's passing through. As it passes through more air through the engine at a particular RPM, and that's to do with camshafts and things, we've had to add more fuel to get the mixture right. Alright, so this is this curve here is proportional to the airflow through the engine. It's therefore it's based on RPM. As the RPM increases, camshaft works better or worse, so we need more fuel to match the air. So it would be logical to expect that that curve is repeated at lower throttle positions. The throttle position itself simply limits the amount of air going to the engine, but it doesn't limit how the engine's efficiency works. So if we see that curve here, and we've got some data points that are known, we can kind of predict the shape of the fuel map in those lower areas where we don't have data points. So I'm going to zoom in here, and in the ECU Manager you can configure another page and just put the fuel graph on. So now we can see quite closely how if this point here is right and this point here is right, it's very unlikely that this point down here is going to be less than these two. It's unlikely that there's going to be an air decrease for another 10% of a throttle, alright, and then an increase another 10 again. So what we would do normally is lift this point up so we're getting a smooth transition between these 2 points. Now it's not going to be dead straight, but we'll try and get it close so that when we go out on our next test that this is a little more accurate. Alright, so I did that smoothing as to how I guessed it should look to give you an idea of what to aim for, and that's the way I smoothed it out. We're kind of trying to keep this same shape here through these other lines. Now, you know, maybe we could have lifted that a little bit more, and a little bit more there, and a little bit more there, but this will be a lot closer on that second test session than if we left it like it was. You don't want to alter the points you know are accurate, just kind of smooth it, the shape in between. Alright, so after that we simply want to retest, do the same test again. Maybe the driver's gone out for another test session, and we simply repeat the process. If it's okay and it's close, we can add some of that timing back in. As we can see that the air-fuel ratio is getting better and better and in the range we want it to be, we can keep testing, keep getting the lambda right, and maybe put that timing back in. Alright, eventually, as I say, with full confidence, if you're happy that the ignition map is correct for an engine that's running the correct air-fuel ratio, you can put that last 2 degrees back in, and keeping an eye on your temps and everything, retest again. And it's simply a matter of continually working on making that fuel map better. The reality is it will take a long time. I can tell you that OEMs like Subaru, or any OEM, any car manufacturer will spend more than 1 man year, if not 2 man years, getting the tuning of their fuel and ignition maps perfect. To get the full throttle trace perfect is easy. To get the whole thing right under all conditions is not easy. So it is something that you keep working away at. There's nothing like doing it from data, from the car, at the track, and you will always have something to do with it, and the engine will just keep responding better, so it's definitely time well spent. Alright, so that's it for today. Thanks for tuning in. We went on probably longer than I intended, but hopefully it was good information. There's a lot of supporting webinars on our website on the front page, and any questions you can ask on the forum. Lots of help on there, and you can obviously write into our support network as well. Alright, I'll sign off for now. I'll hang around after I stop the recording and can answer some questions, and other than that, we'll